Let's get this coolant overflow out of our way. 10mm socket, remove this bolt. Lift this up, slide it out of the cowl, and just flip it to the side over here. Over here by the overflow, you can disconnect this hose, and then right here, there's a clamp. You'll have to disconnect this one as well. Lift up on the tab, pop it open. Remove this hose. Now you can tilt the overflow in a way in which it won't leak through either hose connections. Then move this out of your way. Next, unplug the mass airflow sensor connector. Right over there, you'll see a hose clamp. We'll have to remove that with either an 8mm or a flathead screwdriver. Loosen up this clamp. And at the front right here, you'll see two 10mm bolts that hold on this air intake. Remove both. Pull up on this and slide it out of the air intake over here. There we go, set this aside. Let's remove this harness for the mass airflow sensor off of the shroud. Set that aside. Pop this one off too. Follow it along to the driver's side. Remove it off of here as well. And thankfully there's a lot of slack in this harness. Looks like it has some extra wires here. But just push this to the side like this. I'm going to use a bungee cord to support it out of my way. Pull this hose out of the shroud. Let's remove the rest of this intake duct from over there on the throttle body. Use a flathead screwdriver and loosen up this clamp. Then we'll pull this right off. That'll just make some extra space here. That way we can pull the radiator fan shroud out of the way. Slide this off. Set that aside. Push this AC hose off of the shroud. Straight back like that. Let's unclip the radiator hose. Use a trim tool and pop it up. Push this out of the way. Now if you follow the filler tube and the dipstick tubes, there are a couple bolts here that we have to take out. The first one being this one right here for the oil dipstick tube, 10mm socket. Take that out. Now this can move around a little bit. Try not to bend it too much out of the way. The next one that we have to remove is that nut over there. So it holds the transmission dipstick tube in. Drop a 10mm socket on there and then try to break it free. One last one to be removed is that 13mm bolt down there on that bracket, and that holds the oil filler tube. I'm going to stick my socket with an extension down in here. It's a 13mm socket, and I'm going to try and remove this one. Get that bolt out. Now we can move all of these around as we need. Okay, I'm going to separate these two. That way they can move independently of each other. And now hopefully we can get the fan shroud out. The radiator fan shroud is held on by these two 10mm bolts here. And then there are some that go straight down, two on each side. I'll show you those in a second. For now, let's get these two off. And the bolts I'm talking about, there are actually three on each side. My passenger side only has two, but there's one at the back there, one in the middle, and one right at the front here. They're all 10mm bolts, so with a long extension, I'll get those. And on this side, like I said, I have one missing, but there's still one at the front. So let's take all of them out. It's going to be really hard to show you, but I'll try my best. Take out these three bolts on the driver's side. Do the same to the passenger side. Now you can take this fan shroud, pop it back and off of the radiator. Now we just have to fish it out of here. Push the dipstick tubes out of your way. Get it past this radiator hose. Slide it up and out. There we go. Here you'll notice the fan and fan clutch are missing. You do not have to take those off, but I took it off because I wanted to show you a better view of what's happening. Otherwise, I can't really get the camera in there and my arms at the same time to work. So don't take the fan off, go through the fan blades, but here is what's going on behind them. We have to take the belt off next, and this right here is your tensioner. So grab a 15mm socket on a ratchet or a breaker bar or a serpentine belt tensioner tool. Take tension off, remove the belt off of the pulleys, let go, and take the belt off completely. take note of the routing of the belt. I can show you later in the video, of course, but it's always a good idea to remember how it's routed. With a 15mm socket, remove the bolt that holds this pulley on. There we go. Remove the pulley. Make sure the mounting surface is clean. The new pulley should come with a bolt and all the hardware necessary. If for some reason yours doesn't, then just go ahead and transfer your old hardware over. Start the bolt in. Snug it up. And now let's torque it. 37 foot-pounds for this bolt. Right there, perfect. With a 15mm socket, remove the bolts that hold on the tensioner onto the water pump. Here's one at the top. I'm going to leave this one a couple threads in, that way it holds the tensioner while I remove the one on the bottom. Okay, that fell on the floor, that's fine. There's actually a third bolt straight down underneath the pulley. That one is going to be almost impossible to see. Take this out, and as you remove it, keep in mind that the bolt that's straight underneath the pulley and the top one over here that had the long shank are the two longer bolts. This one on the bottom, you can see it's a very flat mounted bolt, so that took a shorter bolt. Just keep that in mind. Remove your bolts, and here's your old tensioner. Take your new tensioner, and I like to start the bolts in. That way they're ready to go when it's lined up with the bolt holes. And just try to line it up. Just try to line it up the best you can. I'm starting in this top bolt because I see that it lines up. The one that's straight underneath the pulley also lines up, and then automatically that means the third one lines up all the way at the bottom. Okay, go ahead and snug them up, and we'll torque them all to 37 foot-pounds. That's torqued. Now let's put the belt on. It's going to be difficult to see what I'm doing here, so I'm just going to show you a diagram of the belt routing on the screen. So I'm going to take the belt and kind of fold it in half here, and I'm going to put this center part right onto the water pump, and then from here I'm going to take the upper half and slide it over the alternator underneath this idler pulley. Then on the other side, I'm going to slide it over the tensioner on this same side from the tensioner and from the water pump. This has to stay behind the fan, obviously, but it has to go down on the harmonic balancer onto the crank pulley. Now I'm going to take it off of the alternator so I can get enough slack and put it onto the power steering pulley. Back down onto the alternator. Now I'm going to make sure that it's sitting in all the ribs where it needs to, and I'm going to leave the idler as the last pulley to go on. That's because it's smooth, it doesn't have any ribs, and it'll be easy to slip it on when it's ready to go on. So I'm making sure that it's sitting everywhere where it needs to be. Okay, it looks like it is. So now I'm going to grab my 15mm socket and remove some tension off of this tensioner so I can slip the belt onto the idler. I'm removing tension off the tensioner. Slide the belt underneath the idler, apply tension or let go of your tool, and now I'm going to go ahead and feel around to make sure that it's sitting everywhere perfectly. If it's not, if it's one groove off, as soon as you start the engine, it's going to start cutting through the belt, so obviously that is not good. And on the crank, on the harmonic balancer, it's sitting perfectly. That's great. Let's get the fan shroud back in, push the dipsticks out of the way. Pay attention to your radiator fins to make sure you don't damage them as you install the fan shroud. Get all the hoses and wires and cables and everything that's supposed to be out of the way. Just get it out of the way. Now with the fan shroud in place, I'm actually not going to bolt it up to the top yet. Make sure these rubber pieces on the top lock into the radiator. That's what's going to hold it tight. And then I'm actually going to start in the bolts that connect the two halves first. There's 3 of them, if you remember correctly. There are 6 of them, 3 on each side. Kind of hard to see. Start them all on by hand. You don't want them to cross thread by accident. And now I'm gonna just snug them up, 10mm socket. Okay, let's do the same to the other side. All right, all 6 are tight. Put this AC line right back where it belongs. Make sure it's out of the way of everything. Reconnect or resecure the upper radiator hose. Before we go too far, let's put this in. Make sure it's seated all the way down. Let's snug up the hose clamp. I'm using an 8mm socket. You can use that or a flathead, whatever you prefer. Just make sure it's nice and snug, but don't over tighten it. Those usually strip out and you have to replace them if you over tighten them. Before we move any further, let's resecure the fan shroud and therefore also the radiator. These 2 10mm bolts, or one right here and one right here. Snug these up. Resecure any wires. Now take your air intake and let's line it up. Make sure it slides in over here and makes a nice tight connection. Once it's in, snug up the hose clamp so that it can be secured. At the front here, there were 2 mounting bolts. Line those up and start them in. Go ahead and plug in the mass airflow sensor connector. Make sure it clicks so it's nice and secure. This is going to be kind of hard to see, but I need to put the dipstick tubes back together, which means the transmission dipstick needs to actually go over the stud of the oil-filled tube. So I unlodged the oil filler tube from the valve cover, and you want to make sure if you do this, try to get no debris in there. And that allows you to twist it in such a way. In which you can hopefully get this stud underneath. Not sure why they didn't make it a bolt, but either way, there we go. Now those are put back together, so you can put the filler tube back in its slot. Grommet in the valve cover, so there we go. I pressed that back in. Grommet's still in. Dipstick or fill tube is down into the valve cover. Let's bolt it down. This one's not going to be easy. Let's bolt this down here. All right, let's snug it up with a 13mm socket. There we go. That's nice and snug. Up here, let's put a little 10mm nut on. Snug this up. Over here, let's reattach the dipstick tube with our little 10mm bolt. Make sure this is nice and snug. Take the coolant overflow. The hose that comes out the bottom here will go to the radiator. Slide it into the 2 slots up there. Push it all the way back. Set it down. And I'm just going to go ahead and start in the bolt. That way it stays in place here. I'll snug it up in a second. I'm going to connect the hose to the radiator. Connect this hose to the top fitting on the radiator and squeeze the hose clamp shut. If your hose clamp isn't good anymore, go ahead and replace it. Squeeze the hose clamp to lock it tight. Snug up the overflow bolt. And this fitting right here was attached to this breather hose just in case it overflows or it needs to take up some air. Then this goes straight down.